Do you trust your parents? Mine staged accidents to collect insurance money, and I was the product. I was 7 the first time my mother pushed me down the basement stairs while my father timed the fall with his phone. She'd called me down for laundry, her voice sweet and normal, then caught my shoulder as I reached the top step and shoved hard enough that I tumbled all the way to the concrete floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and my left arm bent wrong on landing, snapping with a sound like breaking a pencil. My father was beside me in seconds with the phone camera recording, capturing my tears and the bone jutting against skin before calling 911. At the hospital, they told the doctors I'd been running and tripped, classic childhood accident, and filed a claim with our homeowner's insurance for $8,500 to cover medical costs and pain and suffering. That payout funded a 2-week vacation to Mexico, where my parents celebrated their successful business model, while my arm healed in a cast. They made me practice my story every night before bed, rehearsing the details until I could recite them without hesitation. How I'd been rushing to help with laundry, how my sock had slipped on the top step, how the fall happened so fast I couldn't catch myself. The story became more real than the memory of my mother's hand pushing me. The accidents continued every 3 to 4 months, each one carefully planned and executed. At 8, I fell from a tree in our backyard, landing on my spine after my father cut through a branch he knew I'd climb on. That injury earned $12,000 from a different insurance company and put me in a back brace for 6 weeks. At 9, I suffered second-degree burns on my legs when my mother knocked over a pot of boiling water in the kitchen, splashing me while I did homework at the table. She'd positioned me perfectly, asking me to sit there specifically because she needed help with math, then carried the pot past me too quickly with a theatrical stumble. The burn unit documented extensive tissue damage requiring skin grafts, and the claim settled for $23,000. My parents upgraded the kitchen with that money and took me to a water park afterward, like we were celebrating my recovery instead of their latest payout. I was starting to notice patterns by then, how accidents always seemed to happen when money was tight, how my parents were always perfectly positioned to witness and document everything, how they'd researched injury severity before each incident to maximize the insurance settlement. At 10, the accidents escalated to include vehicles because car insurance policies paid significantly more than homeowners' policies. My father started a new job that provided company vehicles, and he realized those came with higher liability limits and different claims processes that were easier to exploit. The first car accident happened on a Saturday afternoon when he told me to get something from the garage, then backed his SUV into me at speed, pinning me against the workbench. My pelvis fractured in 2 places, and my kidneys were bruised badly enough that I pissed blood for a week. The medical bills exceeded $45,000, and the insurance company paid every penny plus $30,000 for pain and suffering. My father acted devastated in front of investigators, crying about not seeing me in his mirrors, about the guilt keeping him awake. Behind closed doors, he celebrated the payday and started planning the next incident. He explained that vehicle accidents were gold mines because insurance companies expected them and rarely investigated thoroughly. As long as the story was plausible and the injuries matched the accident description, they paid out to avoid litigation. He'd been researching optimal injury patterns, studying which accidents produced which injuries and calculating maximum payout potential. My mother kept detailed spreadsheets tracking every accident, injury, insurance company, policy number, claim amount, settlement total, and date of payment. She stored them on her laptop in a folder labeled Family Medical History that looked innocent enough if anyone ever checked. I found the spreadsheets by accident at 11 when using her computer for a school project, and seeing our entire history quantified in dollar amounts made something shift in my chest. Each row represented pain and fear and hospital stays, reduced to numbers and columns with calculations for net profit after medical expenses. She'd even included notes about which injuries were most profitable and which insurance companies paid fastest. There were entries going back before I was born, accidents involving my older brother Nathan, who died at age 6, officially from complications following a fall. Seeing his name in that spreadsheet with settlement amounts next to his death date made my hands shake so badly I almost knocked over the laptop. I didn't know then what to do with this information, didn't understand yet that I was looking at evidence of systematic child abuse and insurance fraud. I was just a kid who'd stumbled onto proof that his parents were hurting him deliberately for money. The accidents got worse at 12 when my father lost his job and their financial pressure intensified. They staged a house fire that I barely escaped from, requiring me to jump from my second-floor bedroom window. I shattered my ankle on landing and suffered smoke inhalation that damaged my lungs. The fire investigators ruled it an electrical fault, never questioning why my parents had been conveniently outside when it started or why I'd been asleep upstairs during a weekend afternoon. The insurance payout was $175,000, covering structural damage to the house, personal property loss, medical expenses, and a substantial pain and suffering settlement for my injuries. My parents bought a bigger house in a better neighborhood and explained to everyone that they were being smart with the insurance money, investing it in our family's future. They enrolled me in private school and bought new cars, living comfortably on my suffering while I struggled with nightmares about being trapped in smoke and flames. The new school meant new doctors who didn't know my medical history, which my parents said was a fresh start. What they really meant was fewer questions about why I had so many injuries in my file. At 13, I started documenting everything because I'd reached an age where I understood what was happening and why it was wrong. My parents weren't protecting me or caring for me. They were systematically injuring me for profit and had probably killed my brother doing the same thing. I needed evidence that proved their crimes, and I needed it before they staged something that killed me too. I started with photos of the spreadsheets on my mother's laptop, using my phone to capture every page showing years of fraudulent claims. Then I searched their bedroom and found a folder in the nightstand containing policy documents, medical records they'd falsified, and coaching notes for insurance interviews. They'd written out scripts for me to follow when talking to claims adjusters, detailing how to describe pain levels and limitations to maximize settlement values. I photographed all of it, uploading everything to a cloud account they couldn't access. The documents revealed they'd purchased policies from 7 different insurance companies, staggering the start dates and rotating which ones they filed claims with to avoid pattern detection. They'd created a sophisticated rotation system, ensuring no single company saw enough claims to trigger investigation. My parents announced they were adding my younger sister Emma to their business model now that she was turning 6, the same age Nathan had been when he died. They explained to me privately that I was getting too old and too big, making injuries harder to stage convincingly without arousing suspicion. Emma was the perfect age and size for believable accidents, and they needed to diversify their income streams anyway. They'd already purchased new policies listing her as a dependent and had started planning her first accident, something simple to establish baseline credibility with the insurance companies. I listened to them discuss breaking her arm like they were planning a grocery list, casual and practical, comparing injury options based on settlement potential. They decided on a fall from playground equipment at a local park, public location with witnesses, simple mechanism of injury that wouldn't raise questions. They planned it for the following Saturday and assigned me to be there as a witness to corroborate their story. That's when I knew I had to act immediately, because I wasn't going to let them hurt Emma the way they'd hurt me and killed Nathan. I spent the next 4 days collecting additional evidence, documenting everything I could find about their fraud operation. I discovered they'd been part of a larger network of families running similar schemes, sharing strategies through encrypted messaging apps and coaching each other on avoiding detection. My father communicated regularly with at least 8 other parents who were injuring their children for insurance money, trading tips about policy selection, injury staging, and claims management. The messages were stored on his phone and laptop, and I used screen recording software to capture everything while he was at his new job. The network had been operating for at least 6 years, systematically exploiting insurance systems across multiple states. Some families had moved frequently to avoid detection, filing claims in different jurisdictions before relocating. One message thread discussed a family whose child had died during a staged car accident, and the responses weren't sympathetic, they were analytical, discussing what went wrong and how to avoid similar outcomes. These people were treating child abuse as an entrepreneurial venture with acceptable loss rates. Friday night before Emma's planned accident, I copied all evidence to a portable hard drive and composed an email to the National Insurance Crime Bureau, an organization I'd found while researching how insurance fraud investigations worked. The email contained links to the cloud account holding photos of spreadsheets and documents, plus attachments of the most damaging evidence, including the network messages and policy documents. I explained I was a minor being systematically injured by parents for insurance fraud, that my older brother had died under similar circumstances, and that my younger sister was scheduled to be hurt the next day. I provided specific details about the planned playground accident, including location, time, and intended injury. I listed all 7 insurance companies my parents held policies with, and included policy numbers where I had them. Then I sent the email from a library computer and went home to wait, continuing through Friday evening like nothing had changed. My parents reviewed Emma's coaching one more time over dinner, making her practice crying on command and explaining exactly how to describe the fall when talking to doctors and insurance adjusters. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies, and my parents were excited, treating the planned accident like a family outing. We drove to the park around 10 a.m. with Emma wearing the outfit my mother had selected because it would photograph well and show injuries clearly. The playground was busy with families, exactly what my parents wanted for witness credibility. They positioned themselves on a bench with clear sightlines while Emma played on the equipment. I was told to stay near her and call them when she fell. But Emma wasn't going to fall because I'd already decided I would prevent this accident, even if it meant exposing everything prematurely. I kept her away from the tall equipment my parents wanted her on, distracting her with other activities while watching for any sign that someone had received my email and was taking action. 20 minutes passed with my parents getting increasingly agitated, gesturing for me to move Emma toward the climbing structure. I pretended not to notice, keeping Emma occupied at ground level while scanning the parking lot for anything that might indicate law enforcement presence. A white sedan pulled into the parking lot at 10:30, and 2 people got out, a man and woman in business casual clothing who didn't look like typical park visitors. They walked directly toward our section of the playground, and I noticed they were watching my parents more than the children. The woman made eye contact with me briefly, and something in her expression told me they were there because of my email. My parents noticed them too, and their body language shifted, tension replacing casual observation. My father stood up and suggested we leave, saying Emma looked tired and we should head home. But before we could move toward the parking lot, the 2 strangers approached and identified themselves as investigators from the Insurance Fraud Division, working in coordination with federal agencies on a child exploitation case. They asked if we could speak privately, and my father immediately demanded a lawyer, his voice rising loud enough that other park visitors started watching. The female investigator calmly explained they had evidence of systematic insurance fraud and child abuse spanning 7 years, involving multiple children and resulting in at least one death. They had warrants for both my parents' arrest and had coordinated with local police who were pulling up at that moment in marked vehicles. Everything happened faster than I'd expected, police officers emerging from their cars while other investigators secured the area and kept curious families at a distance. My mother started screaming that this was a misunderstanding, that someone was making false accusations, but the investigators showed her printouts from the evidence I'd sent. Her spreadsheets documenting years of staged accidents, my father's messages coordinating with the fraud network, policy documents showing their systematic rotation of insurance companies, and coaching notes proving premeditation. My father went silent when he saw the evidence, his expression shifting from outrage to calculation as he realized they had everything. An officer read them their rights, while another approached me and Emma, kneeling down to explain we were safe now and that social services was on the way. Emma was confused, crying and reaching for our mother, who was being handcuffed and placed in a police car. I held her hand and told her everything would be okay, lying because I didn't know if it would be, but knowing it had to be better than what our parents had planned. The next 6 hours were a blur of interviews and medical examinations and Child Protective Services paperwork. Investigators took my statement in a quiet room at the police station, and I explained everything from the first staged accident at age 7 through discovering Nathan's entries in the spreadsheet through my parents' plan to start hurting Emma. They listened without interrupting, taking notes and occasionally asking clarification questions about dates or details. The lead investigator, a woman named Diana Reeves, had been with Insurance Fraud Division for 15 years and said my email had been perfectly timed. They'd been building a case against the fraud network for 8 months after one of the insurance companies noticed suspicious patterns and filed a suspicious activity report. My evidence gave them everything they needed to move immediately on my family and coordinate raids on 6 other families in the network. She said I'd probably prevented Emma from being injured and potentially saved other children whose parents were part of the same operation. That validation helped, knowing the risk had been worth it. Emma and I were placed in emergency foster care that night with a family that specialized in crisis placements. The house was clean and quiet, and the foster parents were gentle but professional, not trying to replace our parents or force affection. They gave us separate rooms and explained the rules, mostly about safety and communication. Emma cried herself to sleep asking for our mother, and I sat outside her door listening because I couldn't explain that our mother had never loved us the way parents were supposed to. We were investments to her, sources of income to be managed and exploited. The foster mother found me there around midnight and sat down next to me, not saying anything at first, just being present. Eventually, she explained that Emma would need time to understand what had happened, and that my job wasn't to be her parent, but just to be her brother. That distinction helped, because I'd been feeling crushed by responsibility, like Emma's entire future depended on me making everything okay immediately. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities dug deeper into the fraud network and my parents' history. Medical examiners reviewed Nathan's death and officially changed the cause to homicide, ruling that his fatal injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall and showed signs of being inflicted deliberately. That ruling meant my parents now faced murder charges, in addition to fraud and child abuse. Investigators found evidence they'd purchased a high-value life insurance policy on Nathan just 3 months before his death, a policy that paid $500,000 and funded their comfortable lifestyle for 2 years. The same pattern emerged with me. They'd increased my life insurance coverage to $750,000 when I turned 12, right before staging the house fire that nearly killed me. They'd been building toward my death, planning it carefully to maximize payout while maintaining plausible deniability. Diana showed me the policy documents and explained what they meant, her voice carefully controlled, but her anger visible. She said some cases stayed with investigators forever, and this would be one of hers. The other families in the fraud network were arrested over the following week, with raids coordinated across 4 states. In total, authorities identified 11 families who'd been systematically injuring children for insurance money, involving 19 children as victims. 3 of those children had died under circumstances officially ruled as accidents, but now being reinvestigated as homicides. The network had been operating for almost a decade, generating an estimated $4.7 million in fraudulent insurance payouts. Some families had been sophisticated like mine, rotating companies and staggering claims. Others had been sloppier, filing multiple claims with the same company until they triggered investigations. The insurance companies who'd unknowingly paid these claims were cooperating fully with prosecutors, providing financial records and claims histories. They were also facing criticism for not detecting the patterns sooner. And several companies updated their fraud detection systems to flag multiple claims involving child injuries. My evidence had blown open a case much larger than just my family, and suddenly, I was being interviewed by federal prosecutors building charges against the entire network. My parents refused to cooperate with investigators, hiring expensive defense attorneys who immediately filed motions to suppress evidence and dismiss charges. Their lawyers argued that the evidence came from illegal searches of private documents, and that I, as a minor, hadn't had authority to access or share my parents' private information. The legal arguments were complex and technical, focusing on procedural issues rather than addressing the actual crimes. But prosecutors had anticipated these defenses and had already secured independent evidence through subpoenas and search warrants executed after my initial email. They'd seized computers, phones, and physical documents directly from my parents and the other network families, building an overwhelming case that didn't rely solely on what I'd provided. The judge denied most of the defense motions, ruling that my email constituted a legitimate tip that gave investigators probable cause for warrants. My evidence was admissible, and the case would proceed. Emma and I stayed in foster care through the pretrial proceedings, which stretched across 6 months as prosecutors prepared their case. The foster family we'd been placed with became our permanent placement after the first month, and they made it clear we could stay as long as needed. The foster father, David Kemp, was a retired school teacher who'd lost his own daughter to leukemia and channeled his grief into helping other children. His wife, Laura, was a nurse who understood medical trauma and knew how to care for injuries both physical and psychological. They didn't push us to talk about what had happened, but they answered our questions honestly when we asked. Emma slowly started to understand that our parents had hurt us on purpose, a realization that devastated her in ways I recognized from my own journey. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares, and Laura would sit with her, patient and calm, until she could sleep again. I had my own nightmares but dealt with them alone, feeling like I needed to be strong for Emma, even though that wasn't actually my responsibility. The trial started 9 months after the arrests, with my parents and 2 other network couples being tried together due to their coordinated activities. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence including spreadsheets, messages, policy documents, medical records, and testimony from insurance investigators. They called me as a witness on the 4th day, and I spent 6 hours on the stand describing the accidents and how I discovered the truth. Defense attorneys tried to paint me as a troubled teen who'd misunderstood innocent situations, but their questions fell apart when confronted with the documented evidence. They couldn't explain the spreadsheets tracking profitability, or the messages discussing injury staging, or the coaching notes teaching me how to lie to insurance adjusters. The jury's expressions shifted from skeptical to horrified as the evidence accumulated. And by the end of the first week, even the defense attorneys seemed to know they'd lose. My parents sat emotionless through most testimony, occasionally whispering to their lawyers, but never showing remorse or acknowledgement of their crimes. The prosecution's medical expert testified about Nathan's death, explaining in detail how his injuries couldn't have resulted from the fall my parents described. The expert had reviewed autopsy photos and medical records, conducted independent analysis, and concluded with high confidence that Nathan had been struck repeatedly before being pushed or thrown down the stairs. His skull fractures showed impact patterns inconsistent with a single fall, and his internal injuries suggested he'd been beaten. The expert's testimony was clinical and precise, but the impact was devastating. Several jurors were crying by the time the expert finished explaining how a 6-year-old had suffered and died, while his parents documented everything for an insurance claim. My mother finally showed emotion then, not grief, but anger, glaring at the medical expert like the problem was his testimony rather than her actions. My father remained stone-faced, occasionally taking notes as if evaluating the prosecution's strategy for weaknesses. The defense case lasted only 2 days because they had little to present beyond character witnesses who testified that my parents seemed normal and loving. Those testimonies collapsed under cross-examination when prosecutors showed the witnesses evidence of the fraud network and asked if normal, loving parents systematically injured children for money. No defense witness could explain the spreadsheets or messages, and several admitted they'd never suspected anything because my parents had been convincing liars. The defense rested without calling my parents to testify, knowing their own words would bury them further. Closing arguments focused on whether the evidence proved premeditated child abuse and fraud beyond reasonable doubt, with prosecutors arguing the documentation made intent absolutely clear. Defense attorneys could only argue for mercy, suggesting my parents had somehow become trapped in a situation they couldn't escape and had lost perspective. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including murder, child abuse, insurance fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Sentencing happened 3 weeks later in a courtroom packed with victims, investigators, insurance representatives, and media. The judge reviewed victim impact statements from me, Emma, and parents of other children who'd been injured in the fraud network. I'd written mine carefully, explaining how my childhood had been stolen and weaponized, how I still flinched at unexpected touches and couldn't trust adults easily. Emma's statement was shorter and simpler, describing nightmares about our parents and confusion about why they'd hurt us. Other victims told similar stories of systematic abuse disguised as accidents, of pain weaponized for profit, of parents who'd failed the most fundamental duty to protect their children. The judge listened to everything, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. When the statements finished, he addressed my parents directly, saying he'd seen many terrible crimes in 30 years on the bench, but few that combined such calculated cruelty with such complete lack of remorse. He sentenced them each to 50 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, effectively ensuring they'd die behind bars. Nathan's murder earned additional consecutive sentences, and the fraud charges added more time. The other network parents received similar sentences, with variations based on the number of children injured and the severity of the abuse. Emma and I stayed with David and Laura throughout high school, and they eventually filed to adopt us legally when it became clear our parents would never be released. The adoption process was emotional because it meant officially severing ties with our biological parents, but it also meant claiming a real family who actually cared about us as people rather than profit sources. David helped me through my college applications, and Laura taught Emma to advocate for herself in therapy and in school. They gave us normal childhoods as much as possible, with family dinners and holiday traditions and support through teenage drama. I graduated high school with honors and got into a good university on scholarships for foster youth. Emma was thriving too, making friends and joining activities and slowly building confidence that our parents had tried to crush. We stayed in touch with Diana Reeves, the investigator who'd helped build the case, and she occasionally updated us on the impact of our testimony. The insurance industry had implemented new fraud detection systems, flagging suspicious patterns of child injuries, and several other cases had been uncovered using similar investigative techniques. At 24, I work for a nonprofit that helps victims of family crimes navigate the legal system, using my experience to guide others through the trauma of testifying against parents or relatives. The work is hard but meaningful, each person I help representing a small redemption for what I survived. Emma just started college studying social work, planning to dedicate her career to protecting children from the kind of abuse we endured. We talk weekly and visit during holidays, and sometimes we marvel at how we survived something that should have destroyed us. David and Laura gave us the foundation to heal, providing stability and safety and unconditional support. They showed us what real parents look like, people who protect rather than exploit, who sacrifice for children rather than sacrificing children for their own benefit. My biological parents remain in prison and will likely die there, and I've never visited or written. They lost the right to my presence when they staged that first accident when I was 7, when they chose money over my safety, when they killed Nathan and planned to kill me, and would have moved on to Emma if I hadn't stopped them. I survived them, exposed them, destroyed their operation, and built a life they never intended me to have. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.